Welcome back to APG Talks. I'm Andrew Gray. I'm your host. Thanks for joining me. We are right in the middle of a brand new season, and we're talking about soul tank management, keys to avoiding burnout. Such an important subject for so many people, not just leaders, but everybody to be dealing with, regardless of what your role is, what place you have in your company or career stage in life. This is such a vital subject, and we've got to spend the right amount of time making sure that we get educated about the subject of soul tank management, and in particular, why it's so crucial for avoiding burnout. And so that's what we're doing in this season. In our first episode last week, I gave a bit of an introduction to the title and explain what each of these words mean. And we're going to take a few moments to review and just go back over some of our key points from episode 1 before we get into some lessons that we can apply and get straight to what is going to help us to actually do what this season is called, to avoid those burnout episodes and to do well with our soul tank management. So as we looked into our introduction last week, we talked about those words, soul, tank, and management. And the fourth word we looked at was burnout. And I want to quickly recap some of those things. When we talked about soul, we talked about the fact that we are three-part people, body, spirit, soul. In other words, we are interconnected and affected. And this is why it's so crucial that whenever we're dealing with any kind of mentoring, counseling, therapy, problem solving, helping people to resolve internal issues, it's crucial that we have diagnosis that is holistic. Because if you only look at one prism or one facet of a person's life, it's so easy to misdiagnose. And so I like to say it this way, that we have to go beyond treating the symptoms and heal the source. And this is why it's so important to have the collision of gift and skill and experience. Gift is to infer the fact that there are people in our lives and around our lives who actually are gifted to work in this arena and to help us in this subject of soul tank management. We are inferring that there are people who are born with an ability, a gifting in this arena. And secondly, we want them to be skillful, which comes from training and it comes from growing their gift, getting better at what they do. And then thirdly, experience. In other words, they've actually got some runs on the board of helping people in the arena that they claim to be some form of expert in. Last week, we also touched on this important idea that just because you have a qualification or certificate does not necessarily mean that you are an authority. Now, by no means am I denigrating qualifications and certificates. I don't want to be misinterpreted on that. Absolutely not. I'm totally into growth and learning and getting yourself equipped for the task that you have. However, what I do want to encourage us to do is to resist the temptation to simply correlate authority or expertise to a person purely because they have a qualification or certificate. What we want is training and skill, and we want to see that they actually have some proof or evidence that they can achieve the results that we want to see achieved. We also touched on this idea that our soul is the primary prism through which we engage with life. In other words, our relationships, our perspectives, our enjoyment, our struggles, everything about our lives and who we are is primarily engaged with through the prism of our soul. And if we don't understand that, we will misinterpret how we perceive things, how we relate to things. And it's so crucial we get that. Also, that our soul is the primary prism through which we navigate our journey of either remaining sustainable or risking burnout. In other words, when you experience a burnout episode or something similar, the impact is felt most greatly in the arena of your soul. The converse of that principle is also true, that when you live healthy and sustainable in your inner life, you do so by building a robust framework in the arena of your soul. What about this second word, this word tank that we talked about? We talked about the metaphor of a vehicle, and we were talking about the fuel in the tank of that vehicle and likening it to the energy or the resources that are available in our soul. And the two are very, very similar. And I brought out this idea that in our daily life, in our activity that we go through, there's a lot of things that we do that actually use up that energy in our soul, just the same way as traveling around in our car uses up fuel resources. And we need to understand that. One of the reasons why just our daily life causes us to burn fuel is because our soul is required to be engaged in all of these activities, conversations, perspectives, dealing with people. Our soul has to be engaged in all of these arenas. And so we burn soul resources, energy, available engagement just by going through our day. We also brought out this vital truth that I really think is going to liberate some people and set them free, especially as we expand on this in the coming weeks. We talked about the fact that there are different fuel economy rates. And just the same as that is true in the vehicle that you drive, depending on the size of the engine and the type of driving and the type of fuel and all the rest of these factors, there are different economy rates that apply to how you burn fuel in your vehicle. Well, the same is true in your personal life, that there are different things that will affect your economy rate. One of the things that we're going to really dive into quite deep in future episodes in this season is we're going to talk about the impact that the relationships in our life have on our soul and in particular on our economy rate and how we burn fuel. The fact of the matter is there are certain relationships, certain types of relationships for many of you listening and watching that actually are causing you to burn fuel at an unsustainable rate. And I'm going to give you some wisdom and some practical pointers on what you can do about that and how you can change the nature of that and how it's impacting your life. Lastly, on this idea of tank, obviously we pointed out this idea that you must refuel yourself regularly. The metaphor of the car, if you don't refuel, you are going to conk out on the side of the road at some point. The same thing is true of what happens to us if we don't pay proper attention to the fact that our soul is like a tank and it needs resources and energy to get through what it has to do in the course of a day and week and so on and so forth. The third word we looked at, and quickly recapping the word management, we talked about this idea that soul tank management essentially, when we use that phrase, what we're talking about is the skillful art of pursuing inner life health and sustainability as a high priority in life. Let me say that again. The skillful art of pursuing inner life health and sustainability as a high priority in life. My goal for you in this season, my goal for everybody that I work with in various aspects of my daily life and my business is to help people to deal with the matters that affect their inner life health. We spend so much time and energy and money and focus on other areas of our health, and rightly so. We talk about nutrition, we talk about fitness, we talk about heart health, we talk about all kinds of health, but we don't pay enough attention to inner life health. And I'm not just talking about the importance of mental health and well-being, although that is highly valid, of course, and we are going to speak to that during this season. I'm talking about the arena of your whole soul, your mind, your will, and your emotions. And it's so vital that we reprioritize this in our life. Otherwise, we are not going to manage well, and it's going to play out somewhere on the pathway of our journey. Here's the truth. This is my firm belief, and I really want you to start to adopt this if you can. That is, you do not have to burn yourself out to achieve enjoyment and success in life. Again, in this episode, I am going to have another go at attacking those who preach the opposite of that message. I'm going to attack their message because it's unhealthy, it's unsustainable, and it is not the only pathway for you to go forward in life. I want to urge you to take a different path and to go a better way. Last week we talked about in our intro episode to this season, last week was we talked about this scary, ugly word called burnout. And for those of you who have experienced it or gotten close to experiencing it, as I shared in my own story last week, you understand just how debilitating this scenario can be. And so if possible, and it is possible, we want to avoid visiting this place at all costs. We want to avoid going there and staying there. And if we've been there or we are at risk of going there again, let's apply the principles that are powerful and effective, make some changes, because the truth is it's a lonely and dark place to be. And the recovery period literally can be very long, complicated, and painful. And as I touched on last week, often a burnout episode or something very similar is often the gateway to more serious mental health challenges and difficulties. And I want to do what I can to help you to avoid going through that experience. Last thought before we get into some lessons for today's episode, that is to understand that burnout and similar experiences, they often, not always, but they often start with depletion, also known as an empty tank. When our soul runs out of resources, we can hit the wall in all kinds of scary ways, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Why? Prevention is always better than cure. I hope that you had the chance to go and visit the burnout prevention test that I spoke about in the first episode. If you haven't, the link is in the show notes and in the description below. You can still do that. That's available to access on my website. Very simple test. It's free. Take you about 3 minutes, and it will give you a personalized report and idea with insights into how serious your risk of burnout actually is. And I'd love you to avail yourself of that. So let's get into a few lessons in episode 2 of Soul Tank Management. Some lessons and principles that are going to help you to do better and actually, hopefully in the future, become quite expert in the subject of soul tank management and doing well to avoid one of these episodes. So the whole season really is about becoming healthy and sustainable. Healthy, pretty self-explanatory, that your internal framework is well situated to cope with all the challenges that life throws at you. And sustainable, meaning we actually have ready, available resources because of our good management to go on a long road trip of life. We don't want to be conking out on the side of the road with every single commute, as it were, that we have to take in our lives. We want to have the smarts and the discipline to apply what is necessary to last the long journey with all the challenges that we have to face. And when you do, when you apply good soul tank management, the truth of the matter is it makes you healthier, it makes you happier. And for those of you who are really about goals and dreams and ambitions and skills and growth and development, all those good things, when you are healthy and happy and sustainable in your inner life, you will actually become more fruitful, more effective in the activities that you're committed to on your daily journey and in your working life especially. So let's talk about 3 interconnected lessons on the road to healthy soul tank management. These 3 lessons I want to share in this episode are all interconnected. They are a step-by-step, they're sequence, and I want you to write notes if you can, or replay this so that it really starts to sink in and you can begin to make changes, because all of these lessons that I'm going to give you, very practical, very accessible, and most importantly, very proven. The first lesson in this episode is to talk about the importance of auditing your diary activity. Auditing your diary activity. In other words, doing a review, taking stock, taking inventory of how busy your calendar is. Now, I hope that you are at least disciplined enough to run a well-organized diary or calendar. Perhaps you don't, and that could be another factor adding to why you feel unsustainable. But even for people who are well-organized and well-scheduled, sometimes we can run ourselves into trouble, because even though we have built the muscle and discipline of organization, we just are simply trying to do too much. We are just too busy. Now, I want to make a couple of comments around this idea, because some of you, when you hear the suggestion to do a diary audit, straight away, a reflex in your soul will react against that. And straight away, you're going to feel this urge to protest against what I'm saying and say, I'm just too busy. A diary audit won't work for me. Well, I want to make a comment to both sides of that response. The first one is to resonate with you. If you're in a busy stage of life, for example, you're in a stage where your career is busy, perhaps you're part of a young family, you might have children at home, or you're in a seriously busy zone of work and study and all kinds of activities, I get it. I want to resonate with you because I know what busy seasons feel like. However, I also want to take the other side of the coin and respond to your response by saying, I don't want you to live in the victimhood of your own circumstances. In other words, simply protesting and saying, I'm just too busy to make change is to suggest that what you're going to do is simply handcuff yourself to your circumstances without even considering the fact that the way you're living could be making you unhealthy and unsustainable. Let me encourage you and urge you to accept and realize and reinforce you have power. You are not powerless. You have power to make changes, even if some areas of your life are not completely within your control. Everybody has at least one lever that's accessible that they can pull on to make some positive change. The fact of the matter is, some people will struggle with a diary audit and an activity audit simply because actually they're not only too busy, but in actual fact, the truth is they are addicted to busyness. This is a scary place to live. We can pile so many activities into our diary that we leave no breathing room, no space, no margin, and of course, therefore, no rest. And our soul can become accustomed to that way of living. And we think that because we become accustomed, that we're actually coping and doing okay. But like most things that cause us to get sick, they happen below the surface. And so maybe a diary audit is one of the best things that you could ever do for yourself, to actually have the courage to ask yourself the scary questions and say, perhaps I actually am borderline, or maybe even across the line, addicted to busyness. You've become so accustomed to a frantic and frenzied pace that you don't know anymore how to live without that pace. That could be you. If you're in that situation, your soul will be like a body that's constantly having adrenaline pumped through it. When people experience something deeply traumatic or shocking, we know that adrenaline can be one of the responses that our body issues in order to try and deal with the immediate pain. Well, there are many people who are operating that way in their soul. They've allowed themselves to become so busy and become addicted to that busyness that it's almost like a soul type adrenaline is surging through them every day, 24 hours a day, and they have become so accustomed to that chemical surge, as it were, running through their system, they can't even remember what it feels like to not be in that state of busyness. One of the words we used to use was the word workaholic. Sometimes you might have a set number of hours in your working life, but you come home and you're still working, and you try to go to sleep and you're still working, and you drive to work and you're still working. And it's not just about the activity of your hands and your feet and your mouth and the tasks that you are trained to do. What I want you to really try and understand, and the thing I want you to try and adopt in this season, is the fact that our soul can be like the imagery of that duck on top of the water, where things above the surface might look like they're under control, but under the surface of the water, the legs are going 1,000 miles an hour trying to keep up with the currents of life. That's how some of you have been living. That's how some of us have lived in the past. That's how some of you will have to navigate in the future, that you appear to be doing okay. But the truth of the matter is that under the surface of your exterior, your poor little soul is paddling away with its legs at 1,000 miles an hour, trying to keep pace with what's going on. In other words, even when you are stopped, you're not really stopped. You might come home from work, you might finish your chores at home, but in your mind and in your emotions and in your will and in your imagination and in your replaying of the day's activities, there is no real off button that's accessible. This is a seriously unhealthy place to be. And I just feel like in this moment, some of you really resonated with what I just described, because that's the picture of your life. You go to work, you come home and do your home responsibilities. Perhaps if you've got children, you're chasing them around with all of their activities. You're trying to stay on top of domestic stuff, work pressures, family pressures, and it's a lot, and I get it. But actually, even in the small windows, when you do get the chance to stop and rest, your poor soul is still going at 1,000 miles an hour trying to cope with what's going on in your life. And this is not a place we want to live for a long period of time. Maybe one of the reasons we need to do an audit in our diary is to search out where our commitments and our obligations and even our sense of duty lies in our diary. The truth is, we need to do what we need to do to reset the foundations and go on a healthy search for margins. Which brings me to the second lesson and the second point in this episode, and that is that when we've done this audit, this review of our diary activity, and tried to discover, are we too busy? Have we committed to too much? Have we left no space for margin and rest? The next thing that we've got to start trying to practice is to insert diary margins. And I've got in brackets in my notes, by force if necessary. The fact is that if you've been living on this high-speed treadmill of your life's journey in your soul, for many of you, you're going to have to get a little aggressive, a little on the front foot, and force some margins, even if they're small to begin with, into your diary by doing some fairly courageous things. Really, what I'm saying is, in your diary, you need to begin erasing the unnecessary. When you're flat out and you're struggling to cope and the price is being paid in your soul, making you unhealthy, you are already in the zone of making trade-offs with your future. Some of you are concerned that if you erase those less necessary things that you will miss out and that FOMO is going to kick in and that other people are going to view you differently. The fact of the matter is you will not thank yourself, neither will your family, neither will your friends if you don't do what you need to do now, and that is to take action, erase the unnecessary. This might just be a season for some of you to review your diary, reset the foundations and start over. It might not be a permanent thing. You may be able to add things back again in the future when you're in a better position. But for now, for the sake of your health and for who you are trying to be, you need to erase the unnecessary. Inserting diary margins is all about scheduled stopping. In other words, literally putting it in the diary. Now, it doesn't matter if you use iCal, Google Calendar, a paper diary, Calendly, some other tool. It doesn't matter what tool you use for scheduling and managing your life. What matters is you need to put resting and stopping into the diary like it were a meeting, like it were an appointment. There's got to be a time in your week, in your month, in your quarter, in your year where you can squeeze margin and rest time in there and push those bookends out and create space. If you don't do this, you are headed down a pathway towards some kind of negative and undesirable consequence. You've got to schedule this deliberately in the diary. We don't want to live like those people who have built a relationship with busyness as if it were an idol to worship before. That's what goes on with some people's lives, and it's terribly, terribly unhealthy. Sometimes the reason why we don't have the margins in our diary that we need to have and would like to have is because we have broken our rhythms. We have taught ourselves to get busier, take on more, try to cope, live with the stress, live with the cortisol in our system, do all kinds of funky things with our neurochemistry because of the way we're pushing ourselves around. And the rhythms that used to work are now broken and have gone out of the window because we have allowed our boundaries to be compromised. Perhaps at some point in the past, we would have said no to some things that we're now saying yes to. Perhaps you've got some relationships, like I alluded to earlier in the episode, where people are allowed to breach your healthy boundaries. It's time for you to take back control again and prioritize that soul tank management where you can reestablish healthy rhythms, healthy boundaries, so that you do better in every arena of your life. Think about it in terms of our sleep patterns. Now, I know many people struggle to sleep. Some people go through patches and seasons where their sleep is broken. Every expert that you can talk to or research will talk to you about the importance of rhythms, in particular circadian rhythms, where our body is hardwired to understand that when the light goes away at the end of the day, our body begins to prepare for rest and recovery. And when that sunlight comes at the start of the day, our body begins to awaken because it's time to go again. We have a natural body clock built in. But if we break those rhythms on either end and we are all over the place and volatile, our sleep will be impacted. Well, that same example is true in every part of our soul, that if we break our rhythms and we let our boundaries move all over the place, or even worse, get pushed all over the place by others, we will find somewhere at some point there will be a price that gets paid in our soul. We need to audit the diary, insert the margins, and fight for a healthy soul. Nobody else is going to do this for you. You have to take action and start. I want you to catch this concept if you can. We need to learn to open up our mind and our thinking to the importance of switching off proportionally. In other words, to the degree that your daily life requires you to be switched on, that is the same proportion that you need to begin building in moments of switching off. In other words, many of you are in a very busy season of your life, in career and in family. Many of you have got responsibilities that are high pressure and high stress. And because of that, you are required to be switched on, as it were, at a high level. Think about it like a bright light that has to be powered up to full capacity and run for an extended period of time. That's like what many of you have going on in your soul. And because you are switched on at such a high level for extended periods of time, you need to begin practicing proportionately switching off for appropriate lengths of time. One of the things that I have produced for people who follow my newsletter and subscribe to other content that I produce is I've written an article called The Art of Arrival. And I'm going to put that in the show notes and the show description as well so that you can get a hold of that. It's some practical ideas about how you can begin to build a muscle whereby you find a point in your day where you properly switch off in your soul and begin to give the light bulb a rest, where you can actually be proportionately off to gain that recovery before you have to be switched back on. Speaking of switching off, for some of us, our recovery could begin and our soul tank management could improve as quickly as learning to switch off technology, screens, devices, apps, pushed notifications, all the stuff that tries to get at us, because we are living in a time in history that didn't have to be coped with in the past. We have got so much data, so much information, so much invasion of our private time because of technology, and we might need to seize control of those devices and those tools again so that they are working for us instead of us working for them. Here's another thought that could help some of you in creating margins. You might need to learn to switch off being contactable. In other words, you might need to set margins in your day where you are not contactable by anybody. Now, I know some of you have already committed yourself to an unhealthy relationship with your work, where work is allowed to contact you 24/7. This is not healthy. This is not even legal. This shouldn't be allowed. This is an unhealthy boundary. You might need to switch your phone off, and I get it. Communicate well. Let people know when you're not contactable. If you're the leader, if you're the boss, your team might need to know when there are periods of time where they will not be able to get you. The point is, you need to stay powerful, take back control, and tell your world what is happening with your time and with your soul instead of the reverse taking place. Some of you, it's not about learning. You already know that one. It's actually about finding the courage to do what you know you need to do. Again, as I did in our first episode of this season, I want to urge you to turn your back on every single message from every single voice that is trying to convince you the way to go forward in life is to work, work, work. There is more to life than your work. And if you commit yourself to that mantra, I promise you, you will pay a heavy price, and those pseudo gurus who talked you into it will not be there for you in your future to pick you up when your life has unraveled and become a mess. Work, work, work is not a mantra to live by. It will not bring you joy, even if you pile up all of the goals, all of the achievements, all of the tangible things that you have on your list that you'd like to acquire. They, in and of themselves, are not wrong until you cross the line where your desire to have them has actually now turned around and they are having you. Do not listen to those pseudo gurus telling you that what you need to do, especially if you're in a growth curve and a growth season in your life, messages and mantras coming at you saying you need to sacrifice family and friends and just put your head down and your bum up for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years and then return to your life, that is a horrible, unhealthy, unhelpful message. And I want to turn you back on it. It's not the way to go. There is a better way, and you do not have to run the pathway of burnout in order to achieve enjoyment and success in life. When we are chasing down the goal of inserting margins into our diary by force, if necessary, there are 3 time frames that we want to look at: weekly, quarterly, annually. Weekly, quarterly, annually. I would suggest that for most people, a trustworthy pattern for helping yourself to set up and be ready for soul tank management. By the way, I should say that just because you audit your diary and you insert margin into that diary, that doesn't mean you have arrived at soul tank management yet. You are on the way, and it's great that there's progress, but these are the preliminary steps that are getting us ready to do soul tank management well. And for most people, looking at the time frames of weekly, quarterly, and annually is a trustworthy pattern for allowing margin in your life and in your diary. What do I specifically mean? Well, what I'm saying is in every week or roughly 1 week period, you need to think in terms of a minimum of 1 day off. Maybe you work 5 or 6 days already. Well, one of those days in every 7 to 10 should be a rest day. I know some people will say to you, no, just work, work, work. And we see people on social media where people have preached with great pride, I work until I collapse and then I rest for a few days. I can guarantee you that person is going to hit the wall at some point in time, and then the spotlight will go away and we won't be celebrating them anymore. Mimic them at your peril. Your soul is not designed to cope with that kind of pattern and that kind of rhythm. Creation and the world around us is showing us that there are natural patterns and natural rhythms, and we've got to cooperate with them if we want to do well. Every 7 to 10 days, try to think in terms of the guideline of 1 day off. Now, those of you with young children, you know that there is no such thing as a full 1 day off unless you go and stay away at a hotel somewhere. But what I'm talking about and what I'm going to get to in the third lesson of this episode is how we stop in that margin where we plug in that 1 day. Weekly is an important time frame. Quarterly is another important time frame. Try to think in terms of the equivalent of a 2 or 3 day stop once per quarter. Now, some of you straight away, when you heard me say that, you went, I can't afford that. That may be true in reality, but part of the reason it's true is because you have adopted some Instagram version of what a getaway and a break looks like. Maybe actually what you need is a cheap camping site for $20 or $30 or $40 a night instead of having to put more pressure on yourself with that getaway that is useful for posting on Instagram. What about one that actually has its purpose as rest and shutting out the rest of the world instead of gloating and boasting to the world our highlight reel, hoping that they will think that we've got it all together? Honestly, who cares what they think? We are interested in this season in your health and good soul tank management. Quarterly, think roughly in terms of a getaway, 2 to 3 days. And then, of course, annually. If you're listening and watching in and from Australia, then you can be grateful for the fact that we have it legislated in our industrial relations law that in every 12 months, your employer must give you a minimum of 4 weeks annual leave. There are many countries around the world where that is not mandated, and people are on a high velocity highway to burnout because they don't rest. And their provisions in their employment don't provide for that rest. When we've got it, we should access it, and you need to use it to get the right amount of rest in the right time frames. 1 day in every week or so, 1 weekend in every quarter or so, 2 to 3 week break somewhere in the course of an annual time period. If you were to begin applying that pattern every week, every quarter, every year, you will begin to establish the building blocks of a pattern that can help you rest and begin soul tank management in a healthy way. One more lesson, one more thought for us in this episode of Soul Tank Management, and that is learn to rest. The key word here is the word learn. If you are guilty of some of those so-called sins that I mentioned earlier of being addicted to busyness, breaking rhythms, breaking boundaries, all kinds of things that have got you in a twisted mess and unrested and unhealthy, you are going to have to learn and relearn rest. New habits will have to be built in your soul in order for you to practice good soul tank management. Think about it in this way. Think about it in terms of light and shade. As I mentioned a few moments ago, when the light is switched on and powered up and at full capacity for extended periods of time, if you don't switch it off and give it rest, you're going to burn the bulb before it has to be burned out. We want to make sure that we are off proportionate to how much we have to be on. And I want you to really capture this one macro thought when it comes to the idea of learning to rest. We started this episode talking about doing an audit in our diary or taking inventory of our activity and getting ready to make changes, erasing unnecessary things in our diary. Secondly, we talked about the importance of inserting diary margins by force where necessary. Once we have achieved those two things, we are now open to the possibility of achieving what I'm about to say. But unless you do step one and step two, you will not get to this third step that I'm about to announce. And that is that in those new margins that we've created, not only must we stop, not only must we rest, we must learn to cease from producing. Cease from producing. What do I mean? I'm talking about the busy cogs and turning wheels in our soul, in our thoughts, our emotions, and our will that wants to be switched on 24/7, replaying, thinking about tomorrow, deciding how we feel about what happened yesterday, what's going to happen tomorrow. You can be away from work, you can be away from your responsibilities and still not be rested, even when you're situated in a block in your diary that was created for resting. The key to beginning proper, healthy rest is when in our soul we cease from producing. We stop dreaming about tasks. We stop writing lists. We stop surveying our diary. We stop replaying all the activity of yesterday and tomorrow. We actually allow our soul to stop. Now, in future episodes of this season, I'm going to talk about how do you actually achieve ceasing from producing. How do you get your soul to stop? How do you actually achieve that so that your soul is not on all the time? It's actually got a chance to breathe. It's actually stopping. It's actually ceasing from producing. And the nirvana of the entire season, you actually get to uniquely customized refueling. All of that is ahead in this season on Soul Tank Management, Keys to Avoiding Burnout. I trust that this episode has been useful, that at least one thought has switched the light on in your thinking. I hope that you will join me for the rest of the season. I hope that you will share it with those that you know who also probably desperately need to hear some of these truths. And I know that if you stick with it, this is going to help you in so many ways. Until next time, bye for now.